All right, so now we're going to add just a little bit of animation to our contacts when we delete them and add them. So we're going to do this with a package that we've already installed. If we look at our client-side package.json, you should have React Transition Group. Okay, so we're going to go to, let's see, we want to go to our contacts. Let's just close all these because I'm sure this is confusing. So our contacts component, which is where we're putting out either the filtered contacts or the contacts themselves, just the regular state. And we're going to bring in here, let's import CSS transition. And we also want transition group. And this is going to be from React-transition group. Now, the way that this works is it helps with CSS transitions. In fact, let's take a look at the documentation. Let's say React transition group. And if we look at the GitHub here, or not the GitHub, but the documentation, let's see, we want a transition group. Let's see if we get a good example here. Okay, so this should give us an example. So if we add an item, let's just say test and OK, and you see how it fades in. If we delete it, it fades out. I just want that kind of effect. So we need to bring in, we brought in the CSS transition and transition group. Then what we have to do is add in right here a transition group component and pass in a class name. Okay, and then inside our map, so we're going to map through both filtered or contacts. Then we have a CSS transition component which takes in some properties like key, timeout, and a class. Okay, and then within the CSS we actually have to add 4 things. One is going to be item enter, and the reason they're using item here is because in the JavaScript or in the React they're using class names as item. So we could call it whatever we want. If we want to call it fade, then it would be fade-enter, fade-enter active. And then they're just setting the opacity and adding a CSS transition to give it a transition to basically make it smooth instead of just, adding it and going away. It fades in and fades out. So let's go ahead and do this. I'm going to grab this CSS right here, and I'm going to put this in my main app CSS down at the bottom. Oh, I already did it, but I'll go ahead and just paste over this. Okay, so item enter, opacity 0, and then when it's active, opacity is going to be 1. We have a transition, 500 milliseconds, and you can change that if you want. Actually, what did I have before? I had 1,000. I also experimented a little bit with translate to kind of slide it in, but we're just going to stick to the opacity, to the fade. But let's make this 1,000 instead of 500. This too. Okay, and this is the exit. So if we're going to use this dot item, then we want to make sure we use item as in our class names attribute. So let's save this, and let's go back to contacts. And right inside the fragment, we're going to put our transition group like that. And we want to wrap everything. So we want to go down here and put that there. All right, now each contact item is going to be wrapped in a CSS transition. So I'm going to take that and wrap that. Now the key needs to go on the direct element inside of the map. So we're going to now move the key to the CSS transition element like that. Oh, let's add a space here. Okay, so we have our key, and then we're also going to add the timeout, which we'll just set this to 500. And then we want to set the class names. Make sure you add an S here. to item. Okay, and we're going to do the same thing with the regular contacts because this is for filtered. So we want the same effect for the regular. So let's take that, wrap this, and take this key off of the contact item, and we should be good. So let's save it. And now let's go back to our application and let's try it out. So if I delete, and you can see we now get that fade effect. Okay, if I add a new contact, we get that fade as well. And it should also work with filter. So if I put an S in here, you see how it faded away? We'll do SA and it fades. When it comes back, they fade in. If you don't want the fade effect with the filter, then just simply take the CSS transition off from around it. Just put it back how we had it. All right, so I mean, I like it, but if you don't want it on the filter, then just remove that part. All right, so that's pretty much it as far as the contacts UI goes and the components. So I'm gonna just try to update this type here. Yeah, so we can change types, we can edit, we can delete, we can do full CRUD and filtering. So in the next section, what we're gonna do is start to integrate the backend that we created. So we want to first implement authentication. And what we're going to do is create a register and a login component, which are going to be forms, and we're going to make a request to our backend to API/user to register and API/auth to authenticate. And then we want to be able to get the token, store it in local storage, and then send that to any protected routes that we want to access, such as any of the contacts routes. Okay, we also need to constantly check to make sure that the user is authenticated, check the token, validate it, and so on. So we're going to get into that in the next section.